My parents did not raise their voice. They did not have to. The silence of the Maine coast in midwinter did the heavy lifting for them. My father stood in the entryway of the mansion he had built on the backs of my unpaid labor and said, "We are done raising your mistake, Grace. Get out and never come back." Then he reached out, twisted the house key off my ring, and shoved me and my 9-year-old daughter, Claire, out into the sideways snow of a nor'easter storm. 3 hours later, there was a knock at their door. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Let me know your story down in the comments. I would love to know who is part of our community today. I did not cry. I did not ask why. Begging is a negotiation, and you cannot negotiate with a bankrupt moral compass. I just gripped Claire's hand, my movements clinical, and walked toward my car. My father thought he was evicting a tenant, but I realized, in that moment, he was actually losing his most valuable asset. I had been the silent investor in their version of family for years, footing the emotional bill while they overspent on my sister Cassandra's ego. I watched as Cassandra was handed the keys to every door I was forbidden from entering, her luxury lifestyle subsidized by the very labor my father claimed was worthless. The wind off the Atlantic hit us like a physical weight. It was the kind of cold that reminded you that nature has no empathy. I buckled Claire into her seat, her small body shaking so hard I could feel it through her coat. I did not tell her it would be okay. That is a romantic lie. And I was done with those. I just told her to stay under the blanket. I started the engine, my hands steady on the wheel. My pride had been liquidated long ago, but my resolve was finally hitting its stride. The road was a white void. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the ice. But I kept driving because sitting still felt like conceding. I was aiming for a cheap motel or a 24-hour diner anywhere that did not require a blood relation to grant me entry. Then it happened. An intersection. A patch of black ice that the tires could not find a grip on. I felt the car slide a slow-motion betrayal of physics. There was a jolt, the sound of metal meeting metal, and then the deafening silence of a Maine winter. Claire made a small, broken sound in the back seat. My heart did not break. It sharpened. I twisted around, scanning her for blood, for glass, for anything that would require a hospital visit I could not afford. She was crying, but she was whole. A woman approached the car through the swirling snow. She was not panicking. She walked with the deliberate, controlled pace of someone who had seen chaos before and found it unimpressive. She looked into my window, saw the bags piled in the passenger seat, saw Claire's tear-streaked face, and she did not bark at me. She did not ask for my insurance. "Why are you out in a nor'easter with a child?" she asked, quietly. I looked at her, my voice sounding like gravel. "We got kicked out," I said. Tonight, her expression shifted. It was not pity. It was an internal calculation, like she was auditing the cruelty of the sentence I had just uttered. She looked at me closer, her eyes narrowing as she checked my face against a memory. "Grace?" she whispered. "Grace Walker." I froze. I had not heard that name spoken with anything other than disappointment in a decade. "It is me," she said, leaning closer so the car's interior light hit her face. "Dr. Catherine." The room in my mind tilted. Dr. Catherine, the mentor from my university days. The one woman who had told me I had a future before my parents decided my pregnancy made me a flaw to be erased. "You are coming home with me," she said. It was not a suggestion. It was a fact. She led us to her house, a few miles down the coast. It was a modest place, but as the door shut behind us, the heat wrapped around me like a shield. The house smelled of old books and cedar, the smell of stability. Catherine did not lecture me. She did not ask for a backstory. She just brought thick socks and a mug of hot chocolate for Claire. I sat on the edge of the couch, still wearing my coat, braced for the shouting or the conditions that usually followed an act of kindness. But the silence in Catherine's home was different. It was not the quiet before a punishment. It was the calm after a fire. For the first time in years, I was not bracing for a blow. I was just breathing. I sat at the table while Catherine made tea. I was still checking the perimeter of my own mind, waiting for the hidden costs of her hospitality to reveal themselves. In my old life, every gift from my father came with a high interest rate of verbal abuse. He would spend $40,000 on a new car for Cassandra because she was the future of the family name, while I was the inventory he kept in the basement to manage the ledgers. Most people see a father and daughter working together and think of a legacy. I knew the transactional truth. I was an unpaid asset. For 5 years, I ran the back end of Frank's architectural firm. I filed the permits, balanced the accounts, and fixed the structural errors in his visionary designs. I was the silent partner in his success. Yet he treated me like a bad debt he could not wait to write off. Looking back, I see the trap of how they normalized their cruelty. My parents did not wake up every morning trying to be villains. They simply believed their own press. In their world, family was not a bond, it was a brand. When I got pregnant at 17, I was not a child in crisis, I was a defective product that threatened their social valuation. They did not kick me out then because they needed a scapegoat to feel superior. They used my guilt as a down payment on my total submission. Catherine asked me why I did not run years ago. It is hard to explain the invisible chains of a survivor. It was not weakness that kept me there. It was a prison without bars, built out of the constant reminder that I was lucky they did not leave me on a doorstep. I stayed because when you are a mother with $0 and a broken spirit, you do not look for a way out. You just look for a way to keep your child fed for one more hour. I was a survivalist in a designer living room. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, cracked plastic badge. It was my future scholar's lanyard from 10 years ago. Back then, I thought my life was an open book. My father took that book and burned the ending. He told me that if I was not smart enough to avoid a mistake, I was not smart enough for an education. For 10 years, I believed him. But sitting in Catherine's kitchen, the balance sheet was finally starting to change. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for years, and tonight, I was finally closing the account. The silence of Catherine's house was broken at 7:42 a.m. by my father's ringtone. I stared at the screen, watching his name flash like a warning light. In the past, I would have answered on the first ring, preparing my apology before he even spoke. Not today. I let it go to voicemail. He called 3 more times before I finally picked up. I did not say hello. I just waited for the noise. "What kind of game are you playing, Grace?" Frank's voice was a jagged edge of entitlement. "You sent the police to my home in the middle of a nor'easter storm. Do you have any idea how that looks to the neighbours? How it looks to my partners?" I leaned back in Catherine's ergonomic office chair, my eyes on a blank spreadsheet. I sent a civil standby to retrieve a $3,500 EpiPen you refused to hand over. I said, my voice as flat as a balance sheet, "If you are worried about optics, you should have considered the liability of withholding emergency medication from a minor. Do not you dare talk to me about liability," he hissed. "I have already contacted the insurance company. You, and that mistake of a child, are officially off the plan. No health, no dental, no life. Consider your coverage terminated. If you want back in, you will be on your knees at my front door by noon." I felt a surge of clarity, not fear. "My coverage was terminated the moment you pushed us into a storm, Frank," I replied. "You are not shocked by what you have done. You are shocked that I have stopped playing along. Goodbye." I hung up. I did not block him yet. I wanted the documentation of his escalation. Catherine walked in, a stack of old manila folders in her arms. She had been my mentor 10 years ago, but now we were partners in a forensic audit. "Your grandparents left you a legacy, Grace," she said, sliding a folder across the desk. "Frank was the executor, but executors have fiduciary duties. And Frank has been treating your inheritance like a personal line of credit." I opened the file. My fingers found the rhythm they had perfected while running Frank's firm for 5 years. I was not a victim anymore. I was the logistics coordinator for my own justice. I started a new spreadsheet. I tracked the interest rates, the withdrawal dates, the missing signatures. I realized my life had not been a family dynamic. It had been a series of unauthorized transactions. I looked at the numbers. $1,500,000. That was the education fund my grandparents had set up for me. Frank had told me it was lost in a market crash years ago. But the dates on these withdrawals did not match a crash. They matched the down payment on Frank's summer home and Cassandra's private school tuition. My compassion was no longer an open line of credit. Tonight, I was filing for their emotional bankruptcy. This was not revenge. It was accounting. I did not become fearless overnight. I became practiced. I was no longer the silent investor in Frank's version of success. I was the auditor who was about to call in the debt. Inside the quiet of Catherine's study, my laptop glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet, lethal retribution. Catherine's hand was steady as she pointed to the last page of the audit. This is not a mistake, Grace. It is a felony. I looked at the signature on the withdrawal slip for the $1,500,000 education fund. It was my name, scripted in the sharp, aggressive slant of my father's handwriting. He had not even tried to mimic mine. He just assumed I would never look. He assumed my silence was a permanent asset he could keep on his books. This was not just a breach of trust. It was a criminal calculation. He had liquidated my future to fund Cassandra's vanity. But as Catherine flipped to a secondary file, the air in the room grew even colder. He is a repeat offender, Grace, she said, her voice dropping into a register of raw, suppressed pain. 25 years ago, I was not just your professor. I was Frank's junior partner. She leaned back, the shadows of the study contouring her face. He staged a financial leak in our first firm. He moved funds, altered the ledgers, and then pointed the finger at me. He did not just want the firm. He wanted to erase me from the industry so he could take full credit for the vision. He bought out my share for pennies while I was fighting to keep my license. I stared at her, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. This was the watchman's silent regret. Catherine had not just appeared in that nor'easter storm by chance. She had been the silent witness to my family's dysfunction for years. I have watched you from the periphery since you were a student, she admitted, her eyes reflecting the grey Atlantic outside the window. I saw him dim your light, exactly the way he tried to dim mine. I stayed quiet because I thought I was protecting my own peace, hoping you would see the truth on your own. I thought I had time, but when I saw you on that road pushed out into a level 4 storm with a child, I realized my silence had become an overdraft on your life. The nor'easter was my deadline. I refused to be a silent observer to your erasure any longer. The leverage Frank thought he had was a house of cards, built on top of a crime scene. He had called my daughter a mistake to justify his own theft. He had spent 25 years thinking he had successfully buried his past, but he had forgotten that I was the one who had been managing his files. I knew where the bodies were buried because I was the one who had been organizing the shovels. We are not going to court for a settlement, Catherine, I said, closing the laptop with a definitive click. We are going for a total liquidation of his reputation. The criminal twist was the kill shot. It removed any remaining path to redemption for my parents. They were not just ungrateful. They were criminals, using my life as collateral for their fraud. My father thought he was done raising his mistake, but he was about to find out that his biggest error was not me. It was assuming I would stay small enough to let him get away with it. I opened a new folder, labeled it The Final Audit, and began drafting the press release. Calm, factual, lethal. The State University auditorium smelled like floor wax, expensive perfume, and the kind of anticipation that precedes a total system collapse. I stood backstage, my fingers tracing the edges of my future scholar's lanyard. For 10 years, this piece of plastic had been a reminder of a life that was stolen. Today, it was my credential for the audit of a lifetime. My legal team had already confirmed the formal filing with the district attorney an hour ago. This wasn't just a speech. It was the public execution of a long overdue verdict. I peeked through the curtain. Frank was in the third row, wearing his visionary architect suit, looking as if he were the primary benefactor of my success. Stephanie sat beside him, already dabbing at her eyes for the benefit of the surrounding faculty, performing the role of the proud mother she had spent a decade failing to be. They were not there to celebrate me. They were there to claim a stake in the new brand I had built under Catherine's guidance. When the announcer called my name as the student speaker and the founder of the Student Parent Support Initiative, The applause was deafening. I walked to the podium and adjusted the microphone. I did not look at the crowd. I looked at the red live light on the camera at the back of the hall. "Good evening," I began, my voice amplified and clinical. 10 years ago, I was told that my daughter was a mistake. I was told that if I was not smart enough to avoid being a mother, I was not smart enough for an education. I paused, letting the silence settle like a heavy blanket. I looked directly at Frank. His smug expression did not just falter. It liquidated. 5 months ago, during a level 4 nor'easter storm, the man who raised me took my house key and pushed me and my 9-year-old daughter into the snow. He told me, and I quote, "We are done raising your mistake. Get out and never come back." The room went dead quiet. I did not need to embellish. The truth carried its own weight. I watched Stephanie cover her mouth, her carefully curated facade cracking in real time. "But here is the transactional reality Frank Henderson did not count on," I continued. "While he was calling my child a mistake, he was busy forging my signature to withdraw $1,500,000 from my education fund." A collective gasp rippled through the auditorium. Heads turned toward the third row. Frank's face went from pale to a bruised purple. He tried to stand, but the weight of 1,000 judging eyes kept him pinned to his seat. I looked at Catherine in the front row. Without her, this moment would have been a fantasy. I would still be a mistake, drowning in debt and silence. She was the one who refused to negotiate with the shame my father had forced upon me. She was the proof that the world is a different, darker place without people who choose to see your worth when your own blood refuses to. "At 2 o'clock this afternoon," I said, leaning into the microphone, "every major news outlet in Maine received a digital file containing the forensic audit of Frank Henderson's firm, the signatures, the dates, and the proof of 25 years of professional sabotage." That was the finisher. The prominent architect was now just a defendant. After the ceremony, the security team had to create a barrier. Frank intercepted me near the exit, his composure entirely gone. He looked older, diminished, his entitlement replaced by a jagged desperation. "Grace, stop this," he hissed, his hands shaking. "We are losing everything. The bank is calling. Your mother has not stopped shaking. Do you want to see us on the street?" I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt nothing but the cold clarity of a balanced ledger. "You told me you did not care where Claire and I went in the middle of a storm, Frank. I am just returning that same level of interest." "We are your parents," Stephanie cried, reaching for my arm. "No," I said, stepping back. "Parents protect their children. You managed me like an asset until you thought the value was gone. Now, I am just calling in the debt. Hand the rest of the keys to the bailiff, Frank. You are no longer authorized to access my life. Goodbye." I turned my back on them and walked toward Catherine and Claire. For the first time in my life, I was not shrinking. I was taking up every bit of space I had earned. The legal fallout was not a drama. It was an audit. The state of Maine versus Frank Henderson did not take long once the bank records were brought into the light. Forgery, embezzlement, and charity fraud are not family matters. They are felonies. Frank was sentenced to 4 years in a state facility. Stephanie received 2 for being an accomplice to the forgery. Their designer furniture was tagged by the sheriff, and the mansion was liquidated to pay back the $1,500,000 they had stolen from my future. I did not feel a surge of triumph when the gavel hit. I did not cheer when the handcuffs clicked. I just felt a sense of closure, like a long, messy ledger had finally been balanced to 0. Anger is an expensive emotion. It requires constant maintenance and a high overhead of energy. I was done paying for it. I rubbed my eyes, searching for a trace of regret. But there was only clarity. This was not a breakdown. It was a final accounting. I used the recovered funds to seed the Legacy Veterinary Centre and the Student Parent Support Foundation. I did not build it to spite them. I built it because I knew, firsthand, that ambition does not matter if you do not have childcare. I knew that being smart is irrelevant if one sick day can knock you out of a career. This was the justice of the sower. My father's version of justice was about punishment and hoarding, making sure someone else felt small so he could feel large. Mine was about architecture, building a future that was so resilient and so full of life that their early attempts to erase me became nothing more than a footnote in a much larger story. 6 months after the sentencing, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was Cassandra. She was working 2 jobs now, her life of luxury liquidated along with the firm. They are in a state-run facility. Grace, she wrote. Dad's health is failing. Mom is a shell. How can you live with yourself knowing they have nothing? I typed my response with a steady hand, my fingers never wavering. I lived for 10 years knowing I was a mistake and a burden, Cassandra. I lived in a house where my potential was treated like a defective product. I did not destroy them. I just stopped being the collateral for their lies. I do not hate them. Hate requires an investment of emotional capital I no longer have available for this account. They made their choices, and now they are living with the market value of those decisions. Do not contact me again. I blocked the number. I opened my contacts, found the entries for Mom and Dad, and hit delete. It was not an act of malice. It was a clean disposal of an expired asset. That evening, I took Claire to the beach near Catherine's house. The nor'easter storm had long since passed, leaving the coast of Maine scrubbed clean and quiet. The air was cold, but the sun was breaking through the clouds, painting the Atlantic in shades of slate and silver. Claire was running through the surf, her laughter louder than the wind. She was not a mistake. She was the most successful project I had ever managed. She was the reason I had survived the storm, and she was the reason I was finally building something beautiful. I looked at Catherine, who was standing on the dunes, watching us with a peaceful smile. She had taught me that no child should grow up believing they are an error in someone else's plan. She had shown me that family is not blood. It is who shows up when the snow is blowing sideways and everyone else has locked the door. To those of you listening who have ever felt like the invisible one, or the one told they were not smart enough because they were human, this is my letter to you. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop trying to earn love from people who only see you as a transaction. Sometimes the greatest revenge is not a fire. It is a quiet morning where you do not have to apologize for existing. You are not a mistake. You are the architect of what comes next. You have heard my story of finding a legacy in the storm. Now, I want to hear yours. Would you choose to forgive or cut ties completely if you were in my shoes? Let me know in the comments below. If this story moved you or gave you a new perspective on justice, please share it and subscribe for more journeys toward reclaiming your worth. Every share helps someone else realize they are not alone in the storm.